So good afternoon, everyone, and welcome to today's virtual gathering of leaders and call to action on racial profiling of Black men during the pandemic. As a way of getting us started, I'd like to do a little bit of level setting about the conversation that we're hoping to have. As you can imagine, this conversation is very weighted and heavy and important for us to have today in light of recent events. And we also recognize that every conversation like this one always feels like it is prematurely closed. So we're going to apologize on the front end for not being able to cover all of the issues, the very important issues that surround this issue, but we'll do our best today to expand the conversation. We also want to just level set by saying that this conversation is not about waxing poetic about these issues as much as it is about sort of walking away with some tangible levers for action, both action within our communities at the federal, local, and state levels, but also action that we can galvanize to restore the health and well-being of our community members per se. So I want to also remind us why we're here in the first place. And first, I'd like to say something about the current state of racial and ethnic disparities in COVID-19 outcomes. As we are all aware, there has been growing evidence to suggest that there's disproportionate risk of COVID-19 mortality and morbidity among racial and ethnic minority populations, and particularly among racial and among Black Americans. And even within those data, we're also beginning to see disparities with respect to gender, so that we are seeing higher rates of COVID-19 mortality among men and racial and ethnic minority men in particular. So this conversation is timely for lots of reasons. And we also want to sort of give folks an opportunity to learn some information about how racial profiling comes to exist in our country, how did we get here, and also what we can do in the future. And so I'm going to start now just by introducing our panelists. And while I'm introducing them, I'm going to ask them to get prepared to give a brief overview of their work, which I'm going to invite them to do before we launch into today's conversation, so you'll know a little bit about the panel members who are before you today. And also I want to thank up front our co-sponsors of this event, the UNC Center for Health Equity Research, also the Society for the Psychological Study of Men and Masculinities at the American Psychological Association, and of course, the UConn Health Disparities Institute. So thank each of you for your support of this really important conversation. Next slide. So first, I'd like to introduce myself a little. Most of you know that I am the director of the Health Disparities Institute, but I'm also associate professor of psychiatry at UConn Health. I currently serve as the president of the American Psychological Association's Division on Men and Masculinities. Next slide. Next up, we have Derrick Brooms, who is a faculty in sociology and Africana studies at the University of Cincinnati, and also serves as a youth worker. He has done a great deal of work and has launched activism in the area of educational equity, race and racism, and diversity and equity. And he has focused most of his research on the lives and experiences of Black men and boys. Next slide. Our next speaker is Paige Fernandez, who is the Policing Policy Advisor in the ACLU's National Political Advocacy Department. Paige develops and implements comprehensive strategies that help to achieve a clear vision of effective democratic and constitutional policing to establish and reinforce community trust in its peacekeepers. Thank you, Paige, for being with us. Next slide. Next up is Dr. Courtney Cogburn, who's an associate professor at the Columbia University School of Social Work and also faculty of the Columbia Population Research Center. Dr. Cogburn brings an enormous amount of experience in the area of the use of technology in exploring racial discrimination and racial profiling, but she employs a transdisciplinary research strategy to improve the characterization and measurement of racism, and it's an examination in the role of racism as it relates to the production of racial inequalities in health. So please help me in welcoming Dr. Cogburn. Next on our panel is Dr. Desmond Patton, who is Associate Dean for Innovation and Academic Affairs and the founding director of the SAFE Lab and co-director of the Justice, Equity, and Technology Lab at Columbia School of Social Work. He is a leading pioneer in the field of making AI, which is artificial intelligence, empathetic, culturally sensitive, and less biased. Next slide. And last but certainly not least is Dr. Rashawn Ray, who is a David M. Rubenstein Fellow at the Brookings Institute. He is also an Associate Professor of Sociology and Executive Director of the Lab for Applied Social Science Research at the University of Maryland, College Park. He is a co-editor of Context Magazine, but he was also a Robert Wood Johnson Foundation Health Policy Research Scholar at the University of California, Berkeley, and currently serves on the National Advisory Committee for the RWJF Health Policy Research Scholars Program. Welcome, Dr. Ray. And so now what I'd like to do is to invite each of our panelists to provide a brief sort of overview of their work as it relates to today's conversation. And we'll start that with Dr. Courtney Cogburn.
Good afternoon, everyone. I know that although the topic is heavy, we're happy to be together to have this conversation with you. I wear many hats, but the work that I do that's most closely related to our discussion today is really thinking about the ways in which we frame and create narratives around race and racism. This has included work in virtual reality, where A Thousand Cut Journey, where we've created an immersive digital experience where you immerse yourself in the shoes of a Black male experiencing racism as a child, adolescent, as an adult. And we're doing empirical work to get a sense of what effect that this has on people, especially thinking about the effects on white liberals. So I'll leave the conversation there and let my other panelists introduce themselves.
Thank you, Dr. Cogburn. Dr. Brooms, could you introduce yourself?
Thank you for having me. My name is Derrick Brooms. A great deal of my work looks at community relations and in the ways in which our communities are able to thrive. So I do a lot of kind of community-based work, which is both from a scholarship realm, but then also from a very much community member realm. So working in neighborhoods that I've lived in or worked in or in close proximity to the universities where I've worked or the schools where I've worked. In particular related to this panel, and thank you for having me, is my work that looks at the killing of Black boys and men. And within that, I'm particularly and very much interested in how Black men make sense of these experiences, not only of their own experiences with racism and profiling, racial profiling, but then also how they're making sense of things that happen across our national lexicon. And so in this work, in many ways, it's not only informs my research, but informs my research, informs my teaching, informs the ways in which I engage with our communities. And so I come to this panel excited to share, but also with a heavy heart that a lot of what we see is a continuation in the ways in which Black humanity continues to be attacked from multiple points. So thank you for having me.
Thank you for that, Derrick. And Dr. Patton, can you introduce yourself?
Hi, good afternoon. It's so great to be in community with all of you. Again, my name is Desmond Patton, and my work really focuses on the role of social media and artificial intelligence in policing and violence. And in particular, I've been developing a framework for understanding how targeted social media policing negatively affects communities of color. And in particular, I developed a theory of everyday racism in digital policing that examines the impact of big data on criminal justice, populations who already face disproportionate police attention. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Desmond. And can we have Paige introduce yourself at this time?
Hi everyone, Paige Fernandez. I use she, her pronouns. It's great to be here with everyone. At the ACLU, I do all of our policing work on the state and local level. So I think there's a lot of work that's related to this topic in particular. But something that I like to say just in general when I'm talking about my work is that I don't think there's any way to disentangle policing from racism and race. Policing reinforces white supremacy and the structures that allow for white supremacy to thrive in this country. And I always like to start out by saying that. You know, in this pandemic, a lot of the work that I've been doing prior to COVID starting has to do around use of force, specifically uses of force against Black men and women in this country, and also around reducing the role, scale, and responsibilities of police in communities of color. So thinking about how our work relates to COVID right now, a lot of the work I'm doing is around the racialized targeting of people of color during this crisis and the continuance of use of force in the middle of a pandemic, even when arrest rates and incarceration rates are going down.
Thank you so much, Paige, for those overview and comments. Dr. Ray, could you introduce yourself?
Yes, so Wisdom, thank you for having me. This is a very, very important conversation. I mean, a lot of the work that I've been doing academically is really broadly looking at the ways that racial and social inequality are manufactured and maintained in society. From a policy standpoint, is really looking at ways that we can strengthen hate crimes, which I know we'll be talking about, particularly when we talk about the state of Georgia, but then also helping to create policy that at its core is focused on racial equity. So over the past couple of months during the pandemic, I've been doing a lot of writing at Brookings about why the racial gap exists in COVID-19 deaths. And of course, as everyone on here will probably agree, it has a lot to do with the structural conditions that Black and brown people are embedded within. And then of late, of course, I've continued to do a lot of work on policing. So I do a lot of work with police officers, thinking about what we do about implicit bias, how we deal with decision-making that officers are making. And so I look forward to having this conversation because I think it's a lot of policy solutions that people need to be thinking about at the local, state, and federal levels that we actually need to be implementing.
I really appreciate it. And I'm so glad that you're a part of this conversation because your comments make clear, again, underscores one of the critical reasons why we're having this conversation, and that is to move towards from evidence and knowing about racism and racial profiling to action. And before we launch into today's conversation, I want to lift up the names of Ahmaud Arbery and Rashawn Ray, and just ask us all first to take a moment of silence collectively as we reflect on the two lives that we've lost. And sometimes we get together for these conversations and we forget who we're actually remembering. And so let's take a quick moment as a group, as a collective, as a village to honor their memories by taking a moment of silence. Thank you. Thank you so much for engaging in that with us, that practice of remembering and recognizing who we're honoring and who we're talking about. So just as a way to lead us into the conversation, I'm going to ask Rashawn and Paige both to first characterize for those who are watching and define racial profiling as we understand it legally. And then lay out some of the facts of the cases that has brought us to this moment, to this conversation.
Paige, go ahead.
Okay, great. So, thinking about racial profiling from a legal policing perspective, racial profiling refers to the act of selecting or targeting a person for law enforcement contact, whether that's a stop, an arrest, a frisk, or a use of force based on a person's perceived or actual race, ethnicity, or national origin, rather than police actually having a reasonable suspicion that they can articulate that somebody has engaged in criminal activity. And so when I think about racial profiling, we see it exhibited in a lot of different policies and practices that police engage in. So things like broken windows policing is a form of racial profiling, and uses of force are forms of racial profiling because they're overwhelmingly used against people of color for absolutely no reason other than cops can then say, oh, I felt like there was a threat to my safety and I had to act on that. And so while we continue to say police interactions really need to be aimed towards investigating actual threats to public safety, often they're not, and their interactions are started on the basis of implicit and explicit racial biases.
Yeah, I mean, I agree. You know, I think, and how you framed this yesterday, Wisdom, when we were talking, is you talked about what are the key issues of profiling during the pandemic. And I think people really have to think about that the level of over-policing we're seeing hasn't went away. The level of structural inequality that we're seeing hasn't went away. In fact, as everyone on here knows, that when we enter crisis mode, inequality is actually exacerbated, not reduced. And I think we're seeing that. So as an example, we know that over 80% of the people who have been stopped and arrested for social distancing violations in New York City have been Black people, have been Latino people. And so we have to be very clear. That coincides to a study, and Paige gave a great definition of racial profiling, coincides to a 2011 study that looked at about 700,000 police stops in New York City. What that study actually found was that overwhelmingly, the people who were stopped and the people where force was used were Blacks and Latinos. Part of the reason why that study is important is because you would assume of 700,000 police stops that there would have been a lot of arrests, but only 8% of people were arrested, most of whom were arrested for resisting arrest. I mean, people should think about that. I mean, obviously, if you haven't done anything wrong, you're going to resist it a little bit, and we know what that looks like. But only 2% of the people who were actually arrested were arrested for having contraband, having a weapon on them. In fact, a higher percentage of white people who were stopped were more likely to be committing a crime. Does that mean white people are more likely to commit crime than Black people? No, not necessarily. But what it means is when it comes to racial profiling, that police officers use a different script by which to think about criminal behavior for white people versus Black people. For white people, they're using actual behavior. They look at their actual movements. They see if they're acting suspiciously. They're more likely to rely on their training. And I've worked with a lot of police departments around the country and really have seen this play out, how it should play out, and then how it shouldn't play out. And interestingly, when it comes to Black people, they're more likely to use skin tone. Part of them using skin tone isn't necessarily just by mistake. You don't make that many mistakes. And I don't know any policy that we actually support that's only 2% successful unless the policy, in this case, stop and frisk, isn't really meant to actually be stopping people who are committing crime, but instead is meant to stop a particular community from engaging in behaviors as they normally would. I think part of also thinking about this is broadly is that Blackness becomes weaponized. And it's oftentimes an overt form of criminalization where Blackness is perceived as being criminal. It's perceived as being emotionally volatile. It's perceived as being predatory. It's perceived as having a higher level of strength. So even when Black people aren't attacking, even when they don't have a weapon, we still see that discrepancy. And it plays out in the stats that Black people are 3.5 times more likely than whites to be killed by police when they're not attacking or when they have a weapon. We're not talking about someone who did anything to the police. We're not talking about someone who did anything. We're simply talking about people engaging in social life as Black people. And so when we talk about profiling, it has a series of implications that are important for people to consider.
I mean, those are such profound and important points to underscore. And it leads me to the question that I posed earlier, or the request, which is most folks are trying to figure out what actually happened in those cases, because there are always sort of mixed media reports about was the person, doing something to bring about, increased surveillance or suspicion of them. And I'd like for Paige to take a moment and sort of walk us through, if she can, sort of some of the elements of the two cases. And I also want to lift up that, this conversation is not a zero-sum proposition, right? It shouldn't necessarily present one. Because we're talking about and focusing on Black men today doesn't mean that we're not also remembering and honoring the scores of Black women and brown women who've also been profiled inappropriately by police. And so we'll be lifting up a specific name in the discussion that Paige is going to lead us through now. So go right ahead.
Thank you. And before launching into this, I feel like it's really important to note, especially in the cases of police violence and brutality, that a lot of the information that the media acquires is through the police and police departments and what police said. So I think we have to take everything they say with a grain of salt before, making our decisions on what we think happened. But as we all know, on February 23rd, Ahmaud Arbery was murdered by Greg and Travis McMichael in Georgia. Greg McMichael was a former Glynn County police officer and prosecutorial investigator. they have their own account of the incident, what happened, but we've all, or many of us, have seen the video, which is a really difficult video to watch. They claimed that there had been a series of burglaries in their neighborhoods, and they literally hunted Mr. Arbery down and lynched him. They shot him multiple times. They have claimed that Mr. Arbery had a gun. That is an unfounded claim that they haven't been able to actually prove yet. And, you know, I think just talking a little bit about where this case stands now, the reason I think it took so long for media to get a hold of this is obviously COVID has taken over all media, but, you know, 2 DAs recused themselves from the case. And there are multiple accounts that the police department told the DAs to not make arrests, to not file charges against these 2 men. Luckily, last week, Greg and Travis were arrested and charged with murder and aggravated assault. And now there's a call for an arrest of the man who filmed the video as well. His involvement is still pretty unclear. Now I'm going to talk a little bit about Mr. Reed, who was murdered last week on Wednesday, May 6th, by the Indianapolis Police Department, which has a history of uses of force against Black people. Police have claimed that Reed opened fire after a car and brief foot chase, but there was live videotaped on his Facebook Live that raises a lot of concerns and actually pushes back on the narrative that police are pushing forward. On this live video, you can hear Mr. Reed calling for help, asking people to come help him because he doesn't want to go to jail. And then you hear one of the police officers who murdered him make a joke about how his funeral would need to be a closed casket funeral. Mr. Reed's case is, you know, the department says they're investigating, but has released no details and no names of the officers who were involved. They said that the officer who made that horrible, horrible comment will be disciplined. And I'm sure later we'll get into what does that mean in policing for police officers. But, you know, community members are calling for accountability, change in legal standards, DOJ civil rights investigations, DOJ pattern and practices investigations. And then finally, as Wisdom noted, over the past 24, 48 hours, we've seen a lot in the news about Brianna Taylor, and I really wanted to say her name here and lift her up. She was a 26-year-old aspiring nurse. She was an EMT. She was helping her community and helping this country to kind of save us from this pandemic. And she was shot at least 8 times by the Louisville police, who said that they were executing a drug warrant for a man who did not, in fact, live in Miss Taylor's apartment complex and had already been detained. Taylor's boyfriend, after police busted into their home unannounced, shot his legally owned gun at the police, and then they shot 20 rounds back and killed Miss Taylor. Luckily, the family has legal representation now and have filed a lawsuit against the police department. So I say all of that, but these are really difficult cases, and I recognize just how much it weighs on probably everybody on this call. And so just wanted to lift up their names here. They all faced incredible injustices, and I'm really looking forward to talking about what we can do to prevent this in the future.
I really appreciate, and I'm sure the audience does too, you laying out those facts. And later on, we're going to talk about some of the complexity with prosecution, right? Like the fact, why is it that we see so many people indicted and charged, but very few sort of brought to justice, full justice in the court system? And we'll come back to that. But before we do, I would like to invite sort of Dr. Cogburn to weigh in here. How do we get here? You know, talk to our viewers about the root causes of racial profiling. How is it that we're in 2020 and we're still dealing with and confronting lynchings, really, essentially, as Paige has pointed out, of Black and brown men and women in our nation? Talk to us about that.
I think all of this is grounded in, you know, our legacy of racial oppression. And I mean, there's the question of sort of what systems and structures have consistently placed Black people in these sorts of positions. But there's also a question of process. What things have we failed to grapple with as a country, especially white people in our country, grappling with the reality, a racial reality of our country, that can bring us to a place of moving on, right? I think the ongoing resistance to accepting that this is the place we live in and not seeking explanations or claiming that people are being sensitive or that these things are actually just being overblown, rather than doing that, rather than grappling with the realities of where we actually live. And I think that resistance is, and not just a resistance, an investment in keeping things exactly the way that they are, part of why we're still here and still having these same conversations. I also think that the narrative around police violence and racial profiling in particular speaks to, what we think of as cultural racism, the ways in which narrative and language and symbolism start to create a script by which we understand how the world works. And essentially we start to reify this notion that Blacks are more dangerous and that Blacks are less human or Blacks are a greater threat because of the images that we share, the headlines that we see. And we only see it for Black and brown people. We don't see it for white people. We're not having a narrative about their encounters with the police and how they operate very, very differently. So I think all of that comes together, trying to, simplify it in a short breath. All of that is coming together. Our legacy as a country, resistant and investment in maintaining that legacy, and the scripts and narratives that we essentially maintain with the ways in which we present and talk about these issues in our public discourse.
That's really, really profound. And I want to invite Desmond and Derrick to jump in here and talk about sort of the different ways. We always talk about racism as operating sometimes invisibly and visibly, right? So that's a sort of common way of thinking about it. But there's another way that we talk about racism as being gendered, as operating differently in the lives of Black men and boys. And I wondered if the two of you, and also Rashawn, feel free to jump in here as well, but starting with Desmond and Derrick, if you could just talk about how does this operate differently in the lives of Black men from your perspectives?
Go ahead, Desmond.
Yeah, I'll jump in really quickly. This is a really tough conversation, but I think what I've learned from my colleague Sean Joe at Washington University is that Black men experience extremely high levels of daily crisis, just generally. And on top of that, when we think about their health and their mental health, oftentimes we're missing a lack of knowledge about the steps that we take to obtain services and even our eligibility for those services as well. But in this particular case, when we talk about Ahmaud, we have a young Black man that had agency over his health, had agency over his life, and was doing the exact thing that we tell Black folks to do. Be healthy, go jog, do the right thing with your health. And the exact thing that we tell people to do to keep them healthy is the exact same thing that got him murdered. And so what does that mean for trust for Black men with any structural, institutional systems that we have? How can we then trust the healthcare system? How can we trust police? How can we trust any of these systems to do the right thing for our lives? And I think that this is what it's calling upon for a lot of Black men, and it's going to have a detrimental impact on our mental health. So those are some of the things that I've been thinking a lot about.
Thank you for that, Desmond. And Derrick, when Desmond was talking, I was reflecting on your work around misandry and Black male misandry in particular. And I thought that you could sort of fill in some of the gaps here that Desmond has sort of led us to about just the daily operation. What does it mean to live with these sort of quotidian stressors, like to be walking around lived space, right? And to have this sense that you're veritably invisible in terms of policy recognition and strategies, but visible in terms of surveillance and constant observation. Talk to us about that.
Yeah, so what I want to first say is that I'm holding space for my college buddy, friend, teammate, Philip Coleman, who was tasered to death in Chicago in 2012. And so even as we had this conversation, it's 8 years later, and I can think about Dr. Amin Henderson in Florida, who is racially profiled as he's trying to provide healthcare and services to homeless folks. And so I'm literally feeling a reaction of what Desmond has pointed us to, and that is that it is our everyday battle, right? So we've heard this discussed in some ways as racial battle fatigue. We've heard this discussed as the kind of everyday stressors. We've heard this in the adverse, negative, and deleterious impacts that it has on our health, sense of self, and well-being, right? And so for too many of our young Black boys and men, they're living in a constant state of stress from being hyper-surveilled, over-policed, and criminalized on a daily basis. And so one of the things that, you know, as Courtney pointed out, is that this is the history of this country, right? So this is not, this is, you know, it is almost fascinating in a very perverse sense to think about how in the 21st century, the technologies that we've developed has actually allowed the state to be even more sophisticated in its abuses and violations of Black people in general, again, holding space for Brianna Taylor and so many others, Renisha McBride. But I'm thinking about Jonathan Farrell, right, who has a tragic accident in North Carolina. He's literally trying to find help, right? And even when Black men try to acquire help for a challenge that they have, a personal challenge that they've experienced, they're still repositioned as a threat. And then therefore, with very little to no interaction with police officials, he's shot and killed in the middle of the street, right? So there's a couple of things that I'm thinking about as it relates to Black men and Black misandry. So the history of this country is one that has burdened Black men, you know, with Du Bois's age-old question. You're a problem. You're a problem for us. And therefore, we have to create systems, measures, policies, and practices that continuously downpress you, right? So you will not enjoy the fruits of liberty and civil liberties, citizenship rights, because as the Plessy versus Ferguson case, all the way to Michael Brown, right, happening in the exact same space, you don't have rights that we have to respect. And so when we think about Brother Ahmaud, this is his case. You are not human, so therefore we don't have to respect you in your humanness. So one of the things that I think about as I think about this violence that is very much racialized and gendered and perpetuated against Black males, it cuts across multiple fronts. And so in one sense, it's embodied. In another sense, it's interpersonal. In another sense, as Courtney and Paige alluded to, it's cultural. In another sense, as Rashawn and Desmond talked about, it's institutional, right? And then finally, I can keep going, it's also symbolic. So that the images that we see on the screen, the representations of Black boys and men in the media and mass media, all of it is, you know, in many ways, repositioning us as inhumane. So, right, I have three things that I can do. I can be a baller, I could be an entertainer, or I can be a problem. And the critical thing about those first two is that you're not far removed from being a problem either. Because if you don't shut up and dribble, if you don't do the things that we tell you and demand of you to do and perform your labor for the benefit of us, then we can problematize you, surveil you, police you, criminalize you, and your achieved statuses, et cetera, can be quickly wiped out because we don't respect your humanity. So as we think about this from this kind of Black misandry standpoint, you know, it's the legacies of fear. So I'm thinking about Emmett Till, right? And again, I mean, I can give you the list. I can give you a list, not the list, of the ways in which Black boys and men are constantly repositioned as threats, hyper-criminalized, which then justifies and creates a rationale for over-policing, right? So one of the things that's critical that Rashawn points out is even as we look at this data, this is police-reported data, right? So we know it's underreported, right? So we know it's underreported. So what that means is that if I'm jogging, if I'm walking, if I go to the store, if I'm driving, if I have a legally sanctioned firearm like Fidel Castro, it doesn't matter, right? It doesn't matter what you're doing. Your degrees won't save you. How you dress won't save you. I don't care if you're an NBA hooper, a professor, a teacher, an everyday citizen, a community member. not only do we reposition you as a threat to us, we're also then weaponized, as our brothers have said, weaponize your Black maleness against you so that we can always surveil you. So we're automatically justified from the jump. So the exhaustion that this then creates.
I'm so glad that you mentioned the exhaustion, and I'm going to invite both Courtney and Rashawn to jump in here too on this point about the, the psychological, the biological, the physiological implications of these, of racial profiling. I mean, we know about the mortal, impacts of racial haling at the extreme end in the cases of our brothers Ahmaud and Rashawn, and of our sister Brianna. But what about the stuff in between? What about what happens to your emotional states and the collective emotional state of the Black community and allies for and with the Black community? Talk about that for us.
I'll just jump in and add at the outset of this is that when we're talking about racial profiling, we're talking about the definition that Paige offered, but we're also talking about, as you're pointing out, wisdom, all that's in between that leads up to that, right? It's the anticipation of that. It's the memory of that. It's the avoidance and adaptation to try and avoid that. It's trying to think about which person on the street is going to be the person that triggers the series of events that leads me to this place. It's the definition that whiteness controls Black personhood and definitions of personhood. At least they think they do, right? So all of that wraps up in this sort of sense of what you're carrying as a calculation that you're making every second of every day. And just because it's become automatic and anticipated and trained and socialized does not mean that it's not taking a very active toll on our mental and physical state. And it's really frustrating, right? When I think about the question of how do we measure racism? How do you measure that? How do you actually quantify that so that we can get a sense of what that does to a person's body? But certainly it shows up in our health inequality data, right? It shows up when you throw in every variable you can possibly think of that would explain differences by race, and you will always find a difference by race remaining. Let's just say that that's racism, right? That's all the stuff that we're struggling trying to figure out how to measure that's still having an effect on our bodies. And as Derrick pointed out and others alluded to, class, your Harvard t-shirt, your degrees will not do enough to protect you from the very many calculations that we all have to make and very real threats. So again, it's those multiple levels that we're having to anticipate, and we haven't touched the surface of that empirically in terms of trying to measure the effects of it. But I bet everybody on this call knows who walks around in these bodies know the effects that it's having on them, whether we're able to demonstrate it empirically or not.
Yeah, and anecdotally, as we all listen carefully to the voices and the stories that young Black men and boys share, and Black men across the life course share with us about, the cumulative exposure of racism, we also are really aware that boys and men have different ways of expressing emotion and sharing things that are, heavy on their hearts. And so this idea that we would have, Black men sort of speaking out and telling their stories as a way to get that evidence is not actually going to necessarily always be what we have at our disposal, right? It's almost like we have to acquire evidence by different methods and tools and strategies if we really want to center those voices. I'm wondering if you could talk a little about, and I'm going to invite Rashawn also here, but you've talked a lot about in your virtual reality work, Courtney, about empathy. And it's always been my position that what we're experiencing on a collective level is a deep penetrating empathy gap for boys and men of color in particular, and particularly Black boys and men, that, in order to humanize, you have to actually have a sense that people are human and worthy of love, cover, and protection. Can you talk about the role of empathy and bridging those gaps and our collective imagination and the potential for it impacting racial profiling practices?
First I have to say, I have to kind of lift up my tension and resentment around having to create a virtual reality experience so that you understand basic humanity. But clearly the data and the journalists and all this sort of presentation of racism and experience that we're talking about was not sufficient, right? So that was the motivation for the piece, but I resent having to do that or feeling like I had to do that. I also make the argument that empathy is insufficient. that I'm not sure I need you to be empathetic, and I'm not sure you're even capable of being fully empathetic of the experiences of Black people. But what I do expect is for you to be competent about how society works and make decisions accordingly about how you want to engage in a way that aligns with your ideology. I'm looking right in the camera in case I'm talking to someone in particular for whom this might resonate. Your beliefs are often inconsistent with what you do in your day-to-day life and the decisions that you make. And trying to make that disconnect more visible to you is part of my motivation for using tools like virtual reality, so that people kind of get in line. And really wanted to think about, how do I create a gut punch? I think empathy might be a piece of that, right? Some level of empathy is a piece of that, but be structurally competent, right? Understand how policies function, do the math and add these things up, and stop kind of putting your head in the sand and pretending that your want for things to be better or your belief that things should be better is sufficient for, social progress.
Great points. Rashawn.
Yeah, I mean, I have a lot of things running through my head, so I'm gonna try and rapid fire and get them out. First big thing is I think about, the comments that were just made, all excellent points. So I'm just gonna build on them. I think about the parallels between COVID-19 and Black policing and civilian brutality, because I think that's key, right? On one hand, we're talking about policing, but we're also talking about civilian brutality, that every single day, Black people walk down the street, go in their dorm room, try to swim in a pool where they're paying HOA fees at, walk into a store and try to make a purchase. And our bodies are continuously criminalized in spaces where we should be safe and where we shouldn't have to worry about those sort of things. Also think about this combination with COVID. There's a study that just came out a couple of days ago showing that Black people were 6 times more likely than whites to be turned away at hospitals seeking testing and treatment. I mean, that's primarily about the ways that Black bodies are devalued, but it also highlights the power of demographic data. See, the data that we talked about policing earlier, we only have available in 16 states. So we know how many people are catch the flu every year. We don't know how many people have coronavirus right now, but typically we know how many people get the flu. We also know how many people get killed by jellyfish every year, but we don't know how many people the police kill. That's a problem, but it's also a purposeful problem that we have to do something about. So from a policy standpoint, we need the data. Data are powerful. Part of thinking about this devaluation is also thinking about Black people trying to get testing and treatment in their neighborhoods. And I think when we think about where this comes from, I interviewed Hakeem Jeffries during Black History Month at Brookings. And he said that America has a genetic birth defect when it comes to race. And part of that genetic birth defect manifests in structural locations and structural conditions that lead to exposing Black people to risk. And I think it highlights a study that I did on physical activity. I did a large study of middle-class Blacks and whites who all had college degrees, all had professional jobs. I was curious about the ways they were engaging in physical activity. Part of what I discovered, of course, is the links between race and place, but it's how that played out. I found that Black men versus all other groups were less likely to engage in physical activity in predominantly white neighborhoods, the same types of neighborhoods where Ahmaud was running in, the same types of neighborhoods where Jonathan Farrell tried to seek help in. And part of that playing out is 2 things. First, I found that Black men go through what we call a signaling process. So Black people, Black men in particular are trying to cope to survive. Middle-class Black men do things like wear an alumni t-shirt when they go for a run. They run in well-lit areas. They smile and wave at their neighbors. They always carry ID on them. Things that when you're going for a jog, you don't do unless you are literally trying to survive that jog. So while Black people are trying to go out, and Black men in particular, are engaging in behaviors that's supposed to extend life, we actually see how those same behaviors might actually truncate life. And so I've been writing a lot about this in the conversation. I've talked to NPR about it, and it highlights a collective memory that Black men have. It leads to a higher level of stress. It leads to our allostatic load being out of whack, where we can continuously deal with this stress, but on the insides, we are literally dying a slow death that leads to us having a higher exposure to these pre-existing health conditions that leads to us being more likely to die from COVID-19.
Those are all really exceptional. You really packed that in. Hats off to you, brother. You you did that in that short minute. And I want to just sort of go right from that point to a point that Desmond raised earlier, which I think is closely connected. As we're talking about the highly visible racial profiling incidents we're lifting up today, we're also cognizant that racial profiling happens in medicine and in healthcare, and that some of the tools that we're talking about even utilizing or deploying in our recovery strategies, such as those we're using for contact tracing, have the potential, right, to also locate, stigmatize, identify, make less anonymous people in certain communities. And Desmond has done a lot of work on the use of technology and AI, and I wondered if you could weigh in here about sort of this strategy and the implications for Black men's willingness to participate in those activities, given what we know.
Yeah, the use of technology is highly complex in this space, right? So on one end, we have what my colleague Dr. McElwain has been able to underscore is that these tools that we have at our disposal, digital media, social networking platforms, open web, user-generated images have been able to capture the daily lived experiences of Black folks and been able to showcase a real lived reality, right? So we can see happening without pathologizing narrative at play, and yet the same tools can be used as weapons against those folks, right? And so a big issue that we have is that we don't have enough folks like us that are part of developing those tools in the first place. We don't have psychologists and social workers and sociologists and community members and youth that are a part of the actual development of these tools. We have trusted large tech companies to do the right thing, and over again, they are not. And so what happens is that we don't have complete data systems. We are missing nuances in the data. We are missing these critical stories that showcase who we are and what we're doing. We're missing context, and yet we are trusting that these tools are going to do the right thing. And so this is a major challenge, and we're seeing this being reproduced in contact tracing. And so my colleague, Mary Gray, has been pushing against this purely app-based contact tracing mechanism, and with the hope that we involve more community members, more youth in these processes.
So important. And I wonder, Paige, if you can weigh in here about the potential legal, from an individual rights, I guess, perspective, sort of complications or issues, things we need to be contemplating as we are sort of thinking about deploying such tools in the COVID-19 response, and particularly as it relates to communities of color who are already, under the weight of disproportionate racial profiling.
Yeah, absolutely. So I think something just to start out with is that I think, we're talking a lot about like tech washing in the policing space, and how specifically the criminal legal system is using technology to claim that they're not biased, they're not discriminating. They're like, we put it through this algorithm, but something that I really like to say is if you put racist junk in, you're going to get racist junk back out, right? And so I think when we're thinking about, it is deeply concerning to me, the discussions that are going on around technology and how we are going to deploy technology to stop the spread of COVID, because we know that these technologies are overwhelmingly used against communities of color to further harm them and to further marginalize them. And, something that I had mentioned yesterday was this idea of like stop and frisk 2.0 is what we call a lot of technologies that police departments are deploying. And so I can imagine this being an even further version, stop and frisk 3.0 of them. Like, we know that Black people are overwhelmingly being impacted by this pandemic. And so who's going to be in the databases, right? It's going to be people of color. Those are the people who are going to have contact tracing going on. And I think it's really important that, the ACLU, our technology and privacy team, is doing a lot of work to push back on a lot of the technologies that are being developed. But I think it speaks volumes that so many technologies that are being developed by organizations that have worked with police departments in the past, that are working actively with police departments currently, right? And we know who police target. I know who these technologies are going to target. And it's concerning, thinking about, them gathering further information on communities of color and potentially using that to further marginalize them and restrict them from going about daily activities.
I appreciate that. And I wondered, I'm going to invite Courtney into this next question, because it builds on what Paige has just shared, but also links to some conversations we've been having about the use of technology and the implications of the social contract, right, on people's receptivity of that. Some have said, and there was an article in The Atlantic, a piece about, racism and the social contract with Black America, and the fact that these continual experiences with racism, both overt and implicit, have significant implications for the trust we form with society, which I think, Paige, has implications for our uptake of technology and our perception of its uses and its intention. So I just want to open it up, and starting with Courtney, sort of talking about this broad idea about the implications of, racial profiling on the broader social contract, and how technology and the use of it and uptake of it is hinged to that, and in what ways hinged to this social contract.
I think the way that I would frame it is that if it's not anti-racist, it's racist, and technology that's not anti-racist is racial oppression on steroids, right? So there's no way around it. If you haven't actively considered how you're not going to unfairly target whole groups of people, you are going to unfairly target whole groups of people, again, just based on the legacy of how you got to that data, how the technologies were developed and built in the first place. And most people who are in positions of power, either developing the technology, making decisions about which technologies to use, making decisions about how to deploy these technologies, are wholly ill-equipped to think through an anti-racist lens about how they're going to disadvantage, or again, unwilling to, because their intention is not to help, but to hurt. And so I think this is fundamental. I also think that we have to think about who we're targeting in these conversations. Too often we are talking amongst ourselves, and white people in particular need to get to the table in an intelligent way, not with your tears, not with your feelings and emotions about how awful all of this is, but get educated and informed and ready to put in work and make sacrifices for what needs to be done. And I think we have to collectively think about how do we better engage and bring in people who see themselves as accomplices in this work, doing a better job also. So I think we have different types of work to do. And ultimately, we need more people who are willing to act in a manner that's anti-racist, not people who are interested in just describing the differences among racial groups and continuously thinking about patterns and, describing the landscape, but actually starting to think about what do we do about all of this. And who's responsible for doing something about it.
So true, Courtney, and your point really makes me think about a conversation we were having yesterday about the role of anti-racist praxis in all of this, and how do we encourage folks to both adopt an anti-racist praxis in a way that will prevent deaths like the ones we've seen among Ahmaud and Rashawn and Brianna, whose names we continuously lift up. Like, how do you join in this work in a way that centers and amplifies and holds space for Black men and boys, and joins in this conversation, and other brown and Black people who are affected by racial profiling? So Derrick, jump in here and pick up on this point around anti-racist praxis and allyship, and how people get engaged in the work.
Well, the first thing I want to say is that, I'm first, I would just want to ditto everything Courtney said, right? I'm gonna snap, and affirm that. But I also want to say that folks don't get to call themselves allies, right? So we need to be real careful with regards to how folks are thinking they assisting, helping, supporting, et cetera. You can't come into a space and claim you're an ally when we haven't seen your receipts. So if we don't see some kind of record of your work, and not just work, your sustained commitment, then your proclamations about being an ally are actually, lip service. And so when we start talking about, this the importance of anti-racism, and this is kind of, piggybacking off what Courtney said just now and yesterday, is this is about the internal work you got to do for yourself which includes, I got to identify all the ways in which I allow bias to operate in my life, in my perception, right? So that even as we talk about like implicit bias, to me, I think that's, microaggressions and implicit bias are just ways that we assuage whiteness, right? Because racism also operates on an institutional, cultural, and structural level. So that's got to be macroaggressions at the minimum. But what we're really talking about are national aggressions, right? So the aggression against Black folks is never halted. And so when I think about like anti-racist work, it's about showing up, again, as Courtney said, like your tears ain't gonna save our lives, right? So you can cry all day and Mike Brown's still laying in the street for 4 hours, right? You can cry all day and Tamir Rice, 12 years old, can't play in the park because he's shot dead, right? So anti-racism, and empathy, these are just words. I'm not interested in words. I'm not interested in labels and categories of ways in which folks can pat themselves on the back and talk about they've arrived or they're woke. We don't need words, right? We need actions. And part of those actions is, my colleagues have talked about is we got to change policies and practices that continue to assault Black life and Black humanity. And so we start talking about trying to move something forward with regards to anti-racism. This means that deep commitment to self-work that allows us to be more aware of the biases, the controlling images, the legacies, the socialization that we're holding on to help sustain our sets of privilege and power. Because anti-racism says I got to give up some of so I got to acknowledge that I got it, and I got to give some of it up, not begrudgingly, not because I don't have any other choices, but because this is what it has to happen if you're talking about equity. And so I think that, one of the most important things that we have that's wrong in this country, we got a language problem. We can't even agree on what we're talking about because too many folks are too quick, especially white folks and folks who believe they're white, to pat themselves on the back because they've done one particular thing. And too many Black folks, as I'm thinking about, what my colleagues have shared, we continue to, Black folks in general, and of course, centered on this conversation, Black boys and men, they continuously bear the burden and the brunt of responsibility to try to prove themselves as worthy, acceptable, and allowable into particular spaces. So anti-racism means that we got to dismantle the system that even says that Black folks got to prove anything, right? And so if we're not talking about work from that standpoint, then we're not talking about anti-racism.
I so appreciate that. Brother Desmond, you want to get in on this conversation about anti-racist praxis and what it looks like and what allyship should contain?
Yeah, I just have an example. So just a few days ago, I'm on my Facebook page, and a white liberal man wrote on his wall that he saw 2 young Black men on the train in New York, and they were harassing an Asian woman. And he said, why are you doing this? Because don't you know that we're trying to fight for you? And don't you know that this is why Ahmaud died? And so he equated this individual behavior with a systematic killing of yet another Black man. And so, my practice is to unfriend those individuals because I don't have the energy or the patience or the civility to engage them. And then he wrote to me and said, why did you leave the conversation? We have to stick together. You know that I'm trying to help you. And so it was very clear to me that somewhere in his liberalism and whiteness that he thought that he was doing the right thing. And yet he was actually causing me more pain, more grief. And that's the missing link for me and for, I think, a lot of folks, is that there is a gap in understanding in terms of the connection between individual behavior, systematic institutional racism, not using the right terms, and a misinterpretation of actions.
Very important. And I want to ask Rashawn and Paige to jump in here, because now we're going to start talking a little bit about one of the central reasons why we've come together today, and that is the call to action part of this. We didn't want the audience and our attendees to leave without some, insights, or at least our perspectives on, actions that we can take. And so as Desmond was talking about his experience, and as others were sharing examples of anti-racist practice, what's clear to me is that it has to be multi-level. that we need changes or action at the individual, family, community, policy level, national level, et cetera. And so I'm wondering, and again, you can weave in any comments that you might have about sort of anti-racism strategies, but talk specifically about policy level action that can be taken. And Paige, when you speak, could you talk a little bit about why there haven't been as many convictions as there have been arrests? So I guess we can start with you if you'd like, and then we can come back to Rashawn.
Yeah, absolutely. I think my belief is that one of the best policy solutions in, specifically, like, policing is my lane, so I would try to stay in that lane, specifically when it comes to policing and racist policing, is that the most effective way to address this is by, really dismantling policing as we understand it and as we know it, and addressing, for as long as we are going to have policing play a key part in our public safety apparatus, what do we need it to look like? And I think a lot of that is about reducing the role of responsibilities and presence of police in communities of color and low-income communities. We really need to divest from law enforcement. They get hundreds of billions of dollars every year and invest in education, in healthcare, and in housing, in actual solutions that we know help people and don't further harm people and further harm communities of color. I think that is one of the most basic things that we can do, is really emphasize that. When you look at just how much money has gone towards policing, not even the entire criminal legal system, but policing, it is absolutely appalling when you compare that to the money that's going into other public institutions and other community-based resources. And then on kind of like a more specific policy level, there's obviously work that we can be doing around use of force. And so to address what you asked, Wisdom, the reason so few people have been convicted, so few officers have been convicted of lethal uses of force, is because our statutes in this country are absolutely horrific. Our state statutes are terrible. In most states across the country, officers are able to use force whenever it could be considered reasonable by another police officer. Not when it is necessary, not when it is their last resort, only when it could be considered reasonable by another officer. So what we see so often is that officers are just allowed to say, I feared for my safety. And because of the white supremacy that pervades this nation, people are like, oh, of course you feared your safety because you saw a Black man. And people are able to justify that because cops said it. I feared my safety, they're good to go. And so that's why we've seen so few convictions, because our statutes across the country are just so weak. And they're designed specifically to help protect officers and not the community members that police purport to serve, right? And so while police are in charge of enforcing the law, they are held above it. And so there's the state statutes, there's a lack of accountability that falls within those state statutes. And, the final thing I want to mention is kind of something that's a little bit niche, but police union contracts. I know that we don't talk a lot about, police unions are kind of out of the normal discourse of policing, but I think it's really important for people to know about. Police union contracts are terrible. They are really, really scary. And if people on this call, I am happy to drop some resources into the chat about this. But there are contracts that delay interrogation of police officers after they've killed somebody. They can go up to 2 weeks without being spoken to. Their history of misconduct is deleted, which is exactly what happened in the case of Tamir Rice's killer. His history of misconduct had been completely erased from multiple different departments, which is why the police chief at the department where he killed Tamir Rice said that he hired him. He had no idea. And they're able to review facts of cases that others don't have access to. And so I think there's a lot of policy solutions here, right? Working on kind of an appropriations budget level of where are we investing our money? Let's not invest in police. Police do not need any more money. And then talking specifically about use of force policies, use of force statutes. We know that there's a range of best practices that exist in certain police departments' policies across the country that we know for a fact, reduce the amount of uses of force in those specific police departments. So really, you know, implementing better use of force policies, more restrictive ones that really only allow officers to use force when absolutely necessary to defend human life.
Those are really important points. And I want to point out to our viewers on Facebook and in our Zoom room today that we are lifting up a lot of options and suggestions that we know will be difficult to take down in this conversation. So we plan to circulate those via our Facebook page where we will post these resources. We'll also tweet them on our Twitter site, and also you'll be able to find them located on our website at the University of Connecticut Health Disparities Institute. So please stay tuned. Rashawn, can you pick up here and weave in some opportunities for collective civic action? Because a lot of folks who, you know, may choose to go about their course of action using strategies that Paige has laid out, right? By talking with their local representatives for lobbying for change in these policies. But others may want to do more grassroots or community-led, you know, advocacy and action. Can you say more about strategies for that while weaving in any other comments about solutions at the policy level?
Yes, yeah, I'll try to give a quick summary of all these. I mean, I've testified at the federal, state, and local level. I think that's a place in particular where academics can play a big role, but I also think that community members can as well, is to have our voice heard when these sort of things are coming up. So I'm gonna highlight a few things. First is, it's an assumption that Black people have to be respectable to be saved by whiteness. And I think that's one of the things that we're hearing with the example that Desmond gave. Everyone deserves the right to humanity, and we're not necessarily seeing that. And we can't outclass racism, as Derrick has said. And so part of this we actually have to deal with is, I think from a theoretical standpoint, we have to treat race as a verb rather than a noun. Race does something to everybody, including white people. And so part of what I've aimed to do is to lay out, as it relates to COVID-19 and policing, shifting from a colorblind to a health equity approach. I think that matters a lot, because with COVID-19, we took a very colorblind approach to it. And then all of a sudden, people were surprised when the racial disparities hit. I think for most of us, we weren't surprised. As it relates to dealing with COVID, I think one policy solution I've really been pushing is doing testing and triage at Black churches. Some of the work I've done with Dr. Abigail Sewell, we found that Black churches actually increase healthcare utilization because people trust the place, people trust the recommendations they're getting. And Congressman Hakeem Jeffries and Governor Cuomo have actually started implementing this. And so I know that I've been in conversations with them. I think the other part, from a civic standpoint, I lay out a typology in line with this racial equity framework, where I talk about shifting from being a racial equity ally or a racial equity learner to being a racial equity advocate to being a racial equity broker. Notice I didn't say ally for the same reasons that Courtney and Derrick were bringing up. People can wear a pen all day long, but oftentimes what happens with allies is that allies are silent. The difference between allies and advocates is that advocates advocate for you even when you're not present. So not like the guy on the subway that Desmond was talking about, but people sitting at tables where those of us on this panel right now, who are all Black and brown people, are not at these tables where other people are at. And one thing we know from Shirley Chisholm is if you're not at the table, you're on the menu and someone's eating you for lunch. So you have to bring a folding chair. And if you can't do that, you need someone to speak up and speak out for you. So we need people to use their voice to speak up and speak out. My grandfather, who served 21 years in the military, Purple Heart, Bronze Star, he would always say, your silence is your acceptance. We have to speak up. The third part of that is being a broker. We have to look at the laws, rules, and regulations of our homeowners associations, our churches, our kids' schools, our neighborhoods, to see if they are employing racial equity, which is very different from just seeing if they don't necessarily seem racist, because that doesn't play out that way. I want to make one final point, is oftentimes policies are mandated federally and implemented locally. That means a lot of the action that can take place in the law enforcement space can be done locally. And as we talked about yesterday, this blue wall of silence, particularly if we look at what happened with Ahmaud down in Georgia. And I grew up in Atlanta, I'm from Tennessee. I know these spaces very, very well. And this blue wall of silence extends from police departments to prosecutors' offices to courtrooms. So what we need to do, we need to repeal Stand Your Ground. It needs to change. Citizens arrest laws need to be reevaluated. We need to enhance hate crime laws, which currently doesn't exist in Georgia, besides saying what a Black person might do to a white woman in particular. And we did this in the state of Maryland. I think this is important for people because it's a good example. It's a law called the Second Lieutenant Collins of the Third Law. Lieutenant Collins was murdered at the University of Maryland where I worked. He was stabbed to death by a white supremacist, Sean Urbanski, whose mother works at the University of Maryland. We got the hate crime law changed in the state of Maryland to strengthen it. And this is a very, very important point that I want to make. Most hate crime laws say that you have to commit a crime in complete totality based on a protected clause. So in the case of Georgia, even if they had hate crimes, it would say that the perpetrators had to actually kill Ahmaud solely based on race. But rarely do people do that. So the Second Lieutenant Collins law changed to say, in partly due to these sort of things. And then I think the final point, and Dr. Keon Gilbert and I have written about this, is about restructuring civil payouts. And Paige touched on this, but this is such an important point because most decisions in police departments are made by what they call the trial board within police departments. It's 3 police officers who make a ruling on what happens. That's completely detached from civil payouts. Civil payouts, which are paid out from taxpayer money. If you look at Chicago, they actually appropriate money for police brutality in the city budget. So these are things that we can change as citizens if we want to do something about what's happening.
Those are very important leads for folks. And I hope, again, that folks are listening to those opportunities. And we will, of course, provide some resources that you can utilize to help you act locally on these issues. I want to bring in Desmond, Derrick, and Courtney to talk a little bit about what we can do to heal in this moment, because we've talked a lot about policy and community change and advocacy, but people are also wounded right now and are trying to grapple with the devastation, really the emotional trauma of this loss, and particularly our young people as they're viewing these incidents on repeat in social media and other media spaces. Talk to us about some of the strategies for collective healing that we can deploy in our families and communities right now. Derrick, do you want to start us off?
I'm going to defer to Courtney and Desmond first, because I know this is right up Desmond's lane as well.
Sure.
In the social work, so I want to make sure that Desmond gets to go. Go ahead, Desmond.
I appreciate that.
Yeah, just really quickly, I think, from a social media perspective, I always tell folks it's okay to take a moratorium from social media. I think that on one end, it could be a great galvanizing force to be in community with folks, to talk about needs, to activate around many of the things that both Paige and Rashawn have mentioned. That's a plus. But on the other end, we're seeing these videos, they're being circulated. They are like viruses that are coming into our psyche each and every day, and we have to protect ourselves. And so it's okay not to look at the video. It's okay to not share the video, and to rejoin social media when you feel like it's okay to do so.
I think that advice is particularly sound and poignant for children and adolescents. And we know from some recent studies that have been done that, adolescents who view racist events online actually exhibit trauma symptomatology that is likened to and on par with that experienced by combat veterans. I mean, these are serious symptoms like, feeling more vigilant and re-experiencing things and feeling numbness. All of those things are potential consequences of viewing these things on repeat. Courtney, why don't you jump in?
Yeah, I think related to that wisdom, just being very cautious of what children are consuming, even if they're not directly consuming the media, they pay attention, they are quite aware of the conversations that we're having. And so thinking very carefully about how to address these issues and protect our children is an important piece of this. There's certainly this notion of radical healing, and the work of Black people is very different than the work of other folks, right, who are encountering these issues. And we have to think very carefully about the nature of trauma in our lives, just how pervasive it is and just how long it has been there in our own lives and our families, and just how deeply affected we are. And I say that not to be fatalistic, but instead to say once we have a grasp of that, and we aren't just sort of putting one foot in front of the other and trotting forward in spite of, once we really start to grapple with the pain that we're carrying and the threats that we navigate every day, we can think more carefully about what's needed for us to heal and take that healing more necessary, and not just accept the burden of struggle as part of Black identity or Black experience in some way. So I think that shift in our own self-narrative is important. And I think another piece that's coming up for me is, I think there's a space, and this is not the space to do it, but for us to think about, rethink our collective strategy as Black people. Where are we targeting our efforts? How are we galvanizing the work that's happening over here in relation to the work that's happening over there, and start to think more as a collective and not just be reactive to yet another threat and yet another death or a negative racial event in our lives. And I recognize all of the important work, right, that's already happening, but I'm just want us to think more carefully about how to strategize as a collective so that the force of what we're doing is magnified.
That's so important, Courtney, because as I think about some of the challenges to progress, one critical one from my point of view, is the splintering of our efforts and this sense of siloing issues, and this idea that Black academics, who are seen as the talking heads, aren't real people experiencing the same things that Black folk everywhere are experiencing, and therefore are not authorities or shouldn't be talking about these issues. So there's that anti-intellectualism sometimes that we can engender, because community are right. They're holding us accountable. They're saying, don't just talk about it, be about it, right? So that's a real fair accusation to lodge against us. But I'm wondering, what can we do to unify and to spark more cross-sectoral, healing or collaboration or collaborative efforts, and generational collaborations and across community collaborations? What are some of those strategies? Rashawn, you look like you had something to add.
Well, I mean, I completely agree with what Courtney was saying. I mean, I think part of thinking through this is there are a lot of ways to make change. But the way I always think about it, and particularly the work I've been doing at Brookings, is one of the only ways to deal with racist policy is to repeal those policies and implement equitable policies. And I think that's one of the things, even within the academy, we're not trained to do that. And I think in a lot of ways, we're missing some unique opportunities to contribute at the local, state, and federal levels where we are. And oftentimes it simply means us going and presenting the research we've already done, and then helping to think through what some of those solutions are. So as an example, the solution that got implemented to do testing in Black churches in New York City came from the work that Ali Sewell and I did, where we were like, wow, okay, Black healthcare utilization increases when people attend Black Protestant churches. And of course, it makes sense when we talk about medical mistrust and all those sort of things. So I think that there are some unique opportunities for us to do that type of work. I think also we can oftentimes, even if we don't know the policy answer, we can help policymakers come up with the questions that they should ask. And I think that's one of the biggest things that I've learned as well. So like this piece I wrote at Brookings, like 5 questions policymakers should ask about AI and technology, is all about saying the speed at which this is changing. And we already know, like studies show that, for example, Black women, about 1/3 of their faces are misclassified when it comes to using facial recognition software. So there are things we can put in place to say, hey, if you actually use statistical significance before you deployed this would actually be something good to do. And then policymakers are like, statistical significance, what's that? It leads to now very basic conversation to help them understand how our work gets published in academic journals. They then start deploying that in policy, and we have a moratorium on the implementation and the speed at which technology is implemented. Because it's not saying that people don't want to use the technology. People clearly do. It's the fact that it's biased, as we heard from Courtney and Desmond earlier. And so part of that is helping to deal with that bias, helping corporations as they're working with law enforcement agencies, which is the way that I see it going. The work I do in the Lab for Applied Social Science Research, where I'm the director in Maryland, we work with these tech companies, and law enforcement agencies just deploy the technology without any oversight. So we need to make sure we get out ahead of this, but I still think learning how to deal with policy is the way we're going to see a lot of change.
I really appreciate that. Brother Derrick, you had some points you wanted to make about self-care and healing at the individual level, even as we're thinking about the policy solutions that Rashawn has eloquently pointed out.
Yes, thank you. And so I think that when we think about the changes, I also think about what Desmond and Courtney said. We got to look inward. And so I'm particularly thinking about Black boys and Black men, and so much of the work that I do And so as I think about talking to young Black men about their college experiences, and in particular dealing with racism on campus, and I want to pair that with the work that I'm talking about now, which is how Black men make sense of racial stereotyping and profiling and killing of Black boys and men. And so one of the questions I often ask, is almost kind of have to ask, have you talked to anybody about this? And this could be any of those things. It could be about racism. It could be about a particular experience. It could be about being racially profiled. It could be about, the response to Trayvon Martin or so many others, right? And overwhelmingly, I'm talking about 99%, no, I haven't talked to anybody, right? So I'm thinking about like R.G. Lord, and she says, my self-care is an act of political warfare. Right. And we're in this moment, and Desmond talked about this a little bit earlier. We're in this moment where we're self-isolated because of quarantine. Many of us who really thrive off of being in community physical proximity with others actually have struggled a bit. I'm thinking about some folks who are in my friend group and my community who have reached out to me or shared with me or shared elsewhere, and I've read about it, where they're struggling because they don't have that sense of connection, that sense of value and matter to others because they're kind of isolated and by themselves. And so I want to just map that and think about that for Black boys and men who are intentionally socialized to think in very individualistic ways, right? So I'm thinking about the ways that we're taught to be real men, and I'm thinking about how I was raised, right? I remember getting whippings, right? And so you think about the violence that's perpetuated on us from multiple fronts. So I would get, in a few instances, I got whippings because I cried, right? Real men don't cry, but it's like I'm hurt. So how is it that I can hurt on the one hand, and I need to express that, but you're also telling me, teaching me, socializing me that you're not supposed to, in some kind of way that diminishes my sense of manhood and masculinity. And so as I think about these experiences that too many of us collectively have, and I think about these experiences that we have individually, we have to make sure that we continue to be in community with folks who love us and care about us, because there are too many folks who literally don't care about us, like literally do not care. I'm thinking about my colleague, Gwendolyn Purifoy, who does research in urban cities, and she looks at, at least in one of these projects, she looked at homelessness. And so what she found was that there were folks who were Black men who were homeless that folks will step over, right? You're inconveniencing me on my way and traveling to wherever it is I'm going. You are so low in my realm of perspective that I can't even see you, right? And so it makes me think about, and you mentioned this earlier, Wisdom, what I talk about is the hypervisibility and that's simultaneously invisible, right? So Black men and boys, in the most regard, we're hypervisible because we're seen as threats and criminals, and then we're invisible from our own sense of humanity and sense of being. And so as I think about the ways in which we're repositioned in broader society, we really have to be attuned in our friend relationships, our romantic relationships, and our families and our communities to pouring into each other, right? So I think that there's multiple things that we have to do to make sure that we're checking in, checking on, and checking up, following through with one another, because to take all of these experiences that we've been talking about, again, not all violence is lethal violence, not all violence is you're dead at the end of it, but pieces of us die. Pieces of us, we're spirit murdered in a lot of ways, in classrooms, in courtrooms, in various social institutions in our society. So I think about the healing that we need, and Courtney talked about this, right? And it's not just any kind of, we need some radical healing where we look inward and toward each other to help us sustain ourselves. Because otherwise, as Rashawn mentioned, to me personally, it's no surprise that Black men died years earlier than other folks. Because not only are we dealing with these, great health risks, we're also holding on to so much, right? We're internalizing a lot of that.
I mean, you have brought us to exactly the place I wanted us to land on at the end of this powerful discussion. right up at 4:30 at the time that we said we were going to end. And we know, again, there's so much more to discuss. So there are a couple of things I'd like to, first of all, I'd like to thank all of the panelists for sharing your time, your talent, your wisdom, your insights, and bringing your full hearts to this conversation, because we're all grieving and mourning here. And it's hard, I know, to have to talk about this and also deal with it at the same time. And then I'd like to remind our viewers that we are encouraging you to continue this conversation, to let us know what other kinds of conversations you'd like to see happen around these topics. Again, recognizing that one conversation will not do. And then the other thing I want to lift up is something that Derrick reminded us of, and that is that this conversation really is about holding space for Black men and boys who are suffering under the weight of racial profiling, and also recognizing that as a community we have tremendous collective strengths and assets that we have been deploying in the midst of this. So this is not to say that our exposures to racial profiling necessarily level us or grind us into dust. We are a powerful and mighty community collective. But the truest truth that has been spoken today is that if we don't hold space for and ensure that the men and boys in our communities feel the love and support and encouragement that we have been lifting up here today, that the weight of these things will be too much to bear. So in other words, it takes all of us to stand up for and fight for justice and equality and fairness, not just for boys and men, but for the men and women and communities that are connected to them and love them. So we want to thank you for your time and attention, and we encourage you to stay in touch with us. We know that each of our panelists are on social media. I think at the beginning we posted people's Twitter handles and other social media contacts. We will also repost those in the chat on Facebook Live and on the Zoom chat for those who are in the room with us today. But thank you so much for your time and attention. Keep moving onward and recognize that we are standing with you in solidarity in our pursuit for justice, equality, and fairness. Have a great rest of your day. Thank you. And I think we're off live. So thank you, panelists. I'm going to close this out because I know we have some participants in the room, and I want to make